everybody, and welcome to another Houdini tutorial. My name is Kate, and today we will be doing one thing that I really love, which is building an actual Stargate. For anyone new to this channel, hi, I love Stargate. It's a really old, outdated show that used to air on the Sci-Fi Network, but overall it's pretty great, and I highly recommend people watch it just for the hell of it, because it was really a staple of like early 2000s programming. And for those who don't understand what I'm talking about, this is what a Stargate looks like. It's really cool. It's got weird kind of water-esque shapes. It's got particle ejection. It's really cool. And it teleports you to other dimensions. So why not build one? So that's what we're going to do today. And I'm going to apologize up front if I seem a little bit off in this little tutorial. I had a pet recently pass away, so the tone of my voice is probably not going to be the most happiest it's ever been. It's probably going to be more monotone. That's what's up if you're wondering why I'm not so enthusiastic about this tutorial. So let's dive into Houdini and see what happens. For this little Stargate, I'm going to make a disclaimer and say if you're here for the modeling aspects of the gate itself, this is not part of this tutorial. I am not a modeler by trade. I am a dynamics artist, so we're going to focus on the dynamics of the portal itself. I'm going to sim this little dynamic gate out so you can kind of get an idea of what it kind of looks like, and then we're going to build the gate and walk through. So while we're waiting for everything to cache out, let's talk a little bit about the Stargate itself. So if you're familiar on the lore of the show, the Stargate is a wormhole to other planets, and there's multiple different gates or addresses you can dial to across the galaxy, and that's kind of like the point of the show, where they don't know where they're dialing to, but wherever their team ends up is a different plot point of the show. It's kind of cool to visualize this particular object in a different way, because I think the last time a Stargate was actually visualized on television was, I want to say 2013, 2012, because Stargate Atlantis just ended, and then we had Stargate Universe for about 2 seasons before MGM went bankrupt. So we're going to try and incorporate that into what we see, but I overall want to stay with the absolute kind of build and look of the original Stargate, where we have kind of these water ripples in the center. But if you think about it in a very interesting way, they've thought about the design of the Stargate based on actual science, which is something that I appreciate about this show. You can see that all the ripples are surrounding the event horizon, which is the center of the gates. And often in the original series, you would see things almost fly into the center of the gate because of the gravitational vortex that actually attract it. I would say in this particular case, I'm more interested in getting some nice velocity swirling patterns and also kind of manipulate the gate into something a little bit more modern that pretty much anybody can attempt. But I also want to make something that's small enough on a scale that my computer can handle. So 2 things you will notice about this tutorial. My gate is very small, or my Stargate is very small, because I don't want my computer to crash and burn. And I've manipulated these velocity fields in a more customizable manner that even you can manipulate into these patterns itself. So keeping that in mind, now we'll jump into the tutorial. So if we take a look at the active gate, when it just explodes, when somebody dials it, it is very much full of particle ejection. You can see at the edges here we have some kind of stray active matter, and I'm honestly not too worried about that, because when you look at it from after you render it with a motion blur and also with other customizable velocities layered on top of it, it's not really much of a big deal. But it does move in the way that a traditional Stargate from the show would operate in. So when it's first dialed as is, because if we're going with the lore of the show, once they dial the Stargate, it kind of explodes like this in front of the camera. And you could speed it up or slow it down, but this is pretty much what it looks like. Let me bring up a different play blast to show you what it kind of looks like when it's inactive and it's just kind of open. So yeah, so this is basically what the gate looks like when it's resting. You can see some movement happening, and the reason why that's there is because even though there's nothing coming out of the gate, you kind of still have to give it movement and give it a mesh-like kind of feel, so you get the idea that, you know, the liquid-esque and the Stargate itself is active and you can step through it on will. So that's pretty much what it looks like on a resting place. So let's dive into the file itself, and I'll explain how I built this. Alright, so jumping up to the top here, you can see I have 3 little nodes. I'm going to color them all green because we're all going to render them anyways. I'm going to start with the geometry of the gate because it's pretty simple and it's just really temp geometry if you really want to understand how I built it. Again, as I stated beforehand, this is not a modeling tutorial, but I'll show you how I kind of built this structure. So basically what happened here is I started with the circle, and the circle has these transformations on it, and these divisions. Then I kind of tilted it on the XY plane so it's facing this direction, and then with the poly extrude I extruded it outwards just so we can have some depth to it. Then I subdivided it so we can have more subdivisions in the mesh, and then I booleaned it with something that I will explain right now. The trick with making a gate type of thing is that you kind of have to predict where your gate is going to be. So basically what I did is I went over here and I imported my dynamics that I created for my gateway, and I made sure it was converted into polygons, normalized everything, deleted any attributes that I didn't need, and then booleaned it with my original geometry, just so I could understand where it's sitting on the sphere, and then also just so the mesh behind the dynamics could actually give proper reflections and also have some noise against it, so there was a little bit more depth. Alright, so I just have to pause a few things because while making this temporary geometry, I did have to fix a few things. So one of that being up here before the boolean, just after the boolean anyway. In order to make sure this particular shape stays in place, you do have to put down a time shift. So you probably want to shift it to frame 2 just so it catches the beginning of the shape. Then you can group together a bunch of polygons that you can capture on the outer edges of your little portal. Poly extrude them, then add a different group to select the triangles within. Poly extrude them as well by pretty much whatever distance you feel like it, and then unwrap your portal geometry. And I do find with portals the best way to unwrap it is through a UV unwrap. So if we turn on our shader here, we should be able to see our little textures, and we can see that there is some warping here, but you can further fill that out with subdivisions, but nobody is really looking at the back of our portal, so I'm not really too concerned on that. Gateway wise, we've cached it out, deleted any attributes we don't need, and then have an out for the gate. And that's pretty much what is for the temporary gate geometry. So keeping that on, we'll scroll it down to here so you can kind of see it better, and we'll turn off the material. So we'll start with our static gate because I think it's a little bit more complicated before we move into materials and lighting and all that. So you can see that this is primarily driven with velocity fields. I'm gonna take that out. And the thing with velocity fields is that you have to generate a volume based on geometry and all that stuff. So it's a little bit complicated, but once you grab the hang of it, it's as easy as pie. So it takes a bit longer than 3.15, but it is doable. If you go over here, we've started out with a VBD, and all this is an empty square, nothing much, and it's got a value of 0.02 for the voxel size, and it's kind of like that. Then we have a box over here, which if we zoom out is really big. It's quite a big box. So it's got a division of 3 in the x-axis and a 0.04 in the y, just so we can have a flat, kind of very thin, uniform shape. And then we put in here a VDB activate, and if I turn on the dark background, which is something you really want to do if you're working with volumes, just so you can see their density correctly, we can see that this is a very thin volume, and that's exactly what we want. So going down to VDB activate, it's got a value of 1 and a prune tolerance of 0. That's pretty much it. If we go over here, we're scattering some uniform points into this shape, which is our box. And if we look at the points from volume, the point separation is very low, so 0.03, and the jitter scale is just there so you can have some jitter. So that's really customizable for you. You can add some dither surface in there as well, but again, it really depends on what you're going for. So if we go look over here, we have our VDB activate, which is plugged into a volume VOP, which is again over here. And you can see something is very different. It suddenly became a circle. Why? Because that's the shape we want. We have some interesting things happening in this volume VOP. We've got a PC open, which is plugged into both our point position and our output 2, which is going into our file, and then another into the position as well. So if we jump up to the position, the input 2, all we have going into that is a curve, which is a circle, and a resample, which is making another circle, which is why if we look at this, it makes a circle, because it's taking in that information from the curve data. So the curve data is very interesting. It's just, again, a customizable curve that you can draw yourself. Houdini automatically adds those coordinates in once you've drawn your curve. And again, the resample is really up to you as well. The one thing you might need is the tangent attribute coming out. So diving into here, we'll explain this a little bit more thoroughly. So looking into here, we have a PC filter, which is going into a subtract. So it's basically subtracting the point cloud information from the original position of the volume. And then it's normalizing it, so taking the 3D normal. And we have another PC filter, which is filtering out the N attribute, and it is feeding it back into this cross product, so we can have a position versus the normal interaction happening. And then this is going into something called velocity, because that's what we're operating on right now. And that's kind of what you will need to do if you want to generate velocity fields. So going over here, we can see our velocity field coming in from our curve. And you can see it doesn't really move, but it's highlighting an area of high velocity. And the area of high velocity is kind of these areas right here, which you can see have been warped into a little curly pattern. Kind of cool. So if we jump over here to step 2 of setting up our velocity field, we have a grid. And this grid is at the center 0, 0, 0 of our scene. It is 3 by 3, and it's got 31 by 31. And if you wanted to control this a little bit more, you could copy this parameter, and you could also paste relative references into this parameter. So you can just edit this as you see fit. Then below it we have a attribute noise, which is, again, if we dive inside, I've kind of edited it just a little bit, so it's a little bit more friendly to me, but this is a attribute noise SOP, and I'll walk through what I've done in a second. I've turned the CD to float, so we have some lines going up and down here that are black and white. And then I've changed the range values to min and max, so we have a minimum value of 0.05, max value of 0.0635. And then scrolling down, I've changed the element size and the offset size as well. Change the fractal type to terrain, and the post-processing to those values. inside of here, you can see that I haven't really changed much, but I've more or less dived inside to see what's going on and what type of noise I can generate from it. And I recommend you do this if you want to understand more noise types about Houdini, because pretty much all of them are listed inside this attribute noise. But that's kind of up to you on how you would like to work with it. So you can see already that this noise it's not animated yet, but you can see it's there, which is exactly what we need for the next step, which is generating points. So if we look at this, we have a bunch of points that are scattered based on our color. So you can edit this force total count to, if you want more velocity trails or you want it more clustered velocity trails, you're probably going to want to add more points. But in this particular case, it works really well. We've turned off relaxed iterations. If we turn it back on, this is what it looks like. And we want it randomized, so we've got randomized point order turned on. And the cool thing about randomized point order, you won't really see a difference because you saw I just turned it off and turned it back on and there's no change. But if we go here to the display point numbers, you can see that changes, right? And that's because it's, again, randomizing the point number. So I'll turn that back off. And over here we have a point wrangle, which is taking our velocity from the normal. So if we look over here, should see something. There we go. So you can see the normal value is facing up, which is exactly what we want. You can also take this wrangle to adjust it in any direction for which you want the normal to change on. Now finally, we have a little trick. So I'm going to turn these all off. You'll notice once again that there's another attribute noise. And what this attribute noise is for is to add more noise into the simulation. So you can see that it's adding noise in, but on the normal attribute. So what this is doing is, again, it's multiplying these values on the normal. So you can see the operation is on multiply, the range values on min and max, and we have a min value of 0.5, max value of 1.5. And what I've done here is that I want this noise to move. So we've offsetted it by this amount, and you can take this equation to animate your noise. It's quite simple. The element size is about 3.16. Again, this is all customizable up to you. This gate effect can be used for pretty much anything. So if we play this back, we should see something change. There we go. And we'll move over to this volume VOP over here. And the secondary volume VOP is rather special because it's plugged into our first volume VOP up here. And the second input is going into our attribute noise that we just discussed, and the first input is going into our first volume VOP. Diving inside, we have some interesting things happening. Is once again generating the velocity attribute. And it's pretty much the same thing as we discussed. It's taking in the point original position and input 2, feeding into a PC open, and we're basically filtering out the normal and the position, and then cross-producting them together back into the velocity. So if we play this back, it should move. There we go. So basically this will be very heavy, but you can kind of see the noise moving up and down, which is exactly what we want to move those volumes. So feeding this into a volume trail, we get some interesting results. Alrighty, so now we have our velocity trails, and the first thing you might think while looking at that, holy hell, is that crowded? But that's exactly what we want, because we're generating points off of these trails. So if we look at the volume trail, guess what we got? I'm going to switch over to my color visualizer so we can kind of blend out all these colors. So if we look at this just with the white turned on, we can not really see a lot happening. But if we switch over to the volume trail, ta-da, we can see the highlights and the kind of lowlights of the higher intensity areas of the simulation. The trail length is 3. The max step is 2000 and the maximum is 1, and we're visualizing the velocity. If we turn that off, things will happen. So if we turn it off, it'll turn white just like we put down with the color stop, and if we turn it back on, it will visualize our velocity. I'm going to keep it on because I think it looks better that way, but that's just my opinion. So we're going to convert this to a polygon. And the reason I'm doing so is that we need to generate points off of this. But because we're doing a gate, we're not really going to need a square shape. We're going to need a circle shape. So I've put a sphere down at the scene, and I've grouped everything inside that sphere inside this group. Now, one way you can do this, I did this velocity sphere with a square because that was easier for me, and that was easier for me to control. Now, instead of doing this step where you can see I'm isolating an area of this velocity field to turn into points and only work in that area, you could probably make this velocity sphere a circle or a flat circle, so you can put the velocity trails inside of it. But in this particular case, this was just easier for me to do that, so don't judge. So we've grouped all the trails inside the sphere, and now we're deleting everything outside this group. And you can see for this group I have bounding type, turn on to this, and the group type is points. If you do not switch this over to points, the bounding type will not work. Some of the bounding objects for points and vertices only work on points and vertices. So if you're wondering why your custom grouped object is not working within the space you've decided, it's probably because your group is not switched over to points. So just keep that in mind. So now that we've deleted the area that we don't want, we've now scattered some points onto it. And this will take a while because we're scattering a lot of points. If you're not working with p-scale, which we are not working with today, you will probably need a lot of points, which you can see here. That is a lot of points. It is about 900,000 points that we're scattering in this circle. And we have relaxed iterations on simply because that works the best with it scattered on lines. So you can see zooming up, we can see this lovely little pattern that's happening. And the reason I really like this pattern is it's very reminiscent of storms, even though it's not really a wormhole-esque shape. So then I've cached these points, so we don't have to worry about how heavy it is, and then I've put it into a pop net. And this pop net is going to be special because it's going to be based around how long you want these particles to live for. It's also going to be generating points from these particles, and it's not going to be generating points on top of them. So we want it to work with what we have in this limited area. So instead of waiting for that to cook out, I'm just going to jump to the VOP. This does take fairly easy to cook out, but in this particular case, I'm very impatient tonight.